When you're young and healthy, if something happens, you have reserve capacity to recover. Whereas older people may be functioning well, but their reserve capacity is quite limited.
Here we're seeing since the 2020 introduction of the injections, more people are dying, less people are being born, and the population is collapsing.
The rise in deaths in 2022, 11.3% increase, is unprecedented. So that is our step change in deaths in Australia and never return to prior levels. I'll start with Australia. Of course, I'm Australian. So Australia's outcomes are very close to my heart. And Australian birth and death trending, I have data. This is annual data from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, looking from 1975 up to 2024. And Australian births are in blue and deaths are in orange. I do this in all of my slides, so it's color-coded. We see Australian births rising over time. We also see deaths rising over time, which is what we expect with a growing population. Australia has a very large migrant population. Australia's fertility has been below replacement since the early 1970s. Their births per female is less than 2.2 and declining over time. So Australia's population growth and rise in birth rates is due to migration and increasing population size. But the key thing I'd like to point out, I've marked with a little syringe, is 2021, the rollout of the COVID-19 vaccines. And you can see 2020, the year before the vaccines, we have a dip. Can you see my cursor or you can't?
Yes, I can.
I can, okay. So 2020, we see a drop in deaths. 2021, it rises and it spikes in 2022, and it doesn't return to the prior trending. And
Wow, so
we also...
Sorry, Sally, I just want to emphasize this. So in 2020, the scary COVID virus that was used to terrify the public into accepting the injection, there was actually a dip in death. There was less dying than the year before. Then the injections come out, i.e. supposedly the cure for the death from COVID, and then the dying really gets going, and it looks like it's been going ever since.
Yeah, in Australia, the big spike in deaths came in 2022, and I'll show on the next slide. So in Australia, we also see falling births. So 2020, I think there was a drop in births. Then there was 2021, there was a rise in births, which is what we expect when people are locked down. But after that, births have fallen off very sharply. And, you know, when we discuss with people working in healthcare, they are reporting increased miscarriages, increased infertility, increased late pregnancy losses, and increased neonatal and infant mortality across all of the countries that I've looked at. So there's been a change in maternal and infant health following the rollout of the COVID vaccines.
And we've seen a similar pattern to what you're just pointing out, which is during the lockdowns, for an infection that wasn't significantly dangerous for young people conceived more babies. So the next year there was more babies born. But as we'll see ahead, you know, by mid-2021, governments were pretending that the shot was excellent and the data indicated give it to every pregnant woman. So it takes a little while to catch up. Plus, there's also the duration of pregnancy being 9 months. So we'll see if that pattern persists of a little delay in the negative impact on births from the shots. What are we looking at now, Sally?
Okay, this is Australian annual registered deaths, and this is showing the percentage change year on year. And what we can see between 2015 and 2020 is that we tend to have fluctuations up and down in the annual registered deaths. So more people die one year, less people die the next year. This is the pull forward effect, where if vulnerable people die in one year, less people die in the following year. So 2020, we had a drop of 1.3% in registered deaths. I think part of this may be a reduction in medical deaths, iatrogenic deaths, because we know that iatrogenic deaths are one of the world's leading causes of death. And under lockdown conditions, people were less likely to seek medical care unless it were an emergency. And I did have interesting data on the Philippines related to that, which I'll speak on later. 2021, we see a big spike, 5.8% increase in deaths. Although you could say that is still part of the regular pattern because we had a drop followed by a rise. But the rise in deaths in 2022, 11.3% increase, is unprecedented. So that is our step change in deaths in Australia and never returned to prior levels.
So this is this is very visible, folks. I mean, clearly 2020, kind of a low year on the relative spectrum for dying during the whole virus lockdown, scary, even with the deadly protocols. But my God, death is off the roof in Australia ever since then, ever since they started the shots.
Yes.
Wow.
And this is what we see in nearly every country that I look at. So this is the Australian weekly all-cause mortality, all-cause registered deaths. This is a death count. And I've got this from 2019. You can see normal patterns. People die in winter. Less people die in summer. There's a very seasonal pattern to deaths. And more babies are born in summer and less are born in winter because people get cozy at the beginning of winter and have their baby at the end of summer. So this is a normal human pattern that we see in 2019 and 2020. 2021, I've marked the start of the COVID vaccine. They started at week 7. And within a few weeks of the rollout of the vaccines, which started slowly in Australia, they didn't have mass uptake. Australia also had very few COVID deaths in 2020 because they had very harsh lockdowns. But then what we see following the rollout, as it gets rolled out, we see a massive spike in deaths to unprecedented levels, the start of the rollout. So then we see the third dose. This is the first booster, is week 46 in 2021, followed almost immediately by a massive spike in deaths. And they rolled that out to the population, starting with vulnerable population and then moving to the rest of the population. And we see, again, rise in deaths. Fourth dose was recommended. And again, now you see there's a step change. Average deaths prior to the pandemic, average deaths following the pandemic, and vaccine rollout have gone up. The peaks are much higher, and the peaks are still increasing, meaning that when people are vulnerable at the end of winter and in cold conditions, we're seeing more people dying. So this is pointing to an increasing and probably progressive vulnerability because the people who died can't die again, but we still have an additional remaining population that is becoming more and more susceptible to dying.
Yeah, and among the various mechanisms to explain that, we have what is now called vaccine-induced AIDS. We have an immune deficiency among the population. I mean, there's a lot of other progressive impacts of these injections, but it makes sense. It's like vulnerable people die from the injection, but many more people are made vulnerable. So they keep refilling that group of people that are vulnerable to dying. And we're seeing it, folks. Look at the screen. Let your logic tell you. Is the death in Australia from the virus of 2020, or is it from the injections that followed? It's looking very clear to me, but I defer to everyone else to use your own senses.
Yeah, the Australian government is still pushing COVID vaccines. Uptake is decreasing, but there are still people taking it. I think they're up to 8th, 9th, or 10th doses in Australia now. Wow. And the government still maintains that it's safe and effective and recommend it. But, if you're on social media in Australia and you see government articles promoting vaccines, all of the comments are routinely negative, meaning that more and more people are becoming aware that there might be a problem. And we see it's the rise in all-cause mortality, meaning people are sick. People are sick and getting sicker. Okay, so in this slide, what I did, the orange line, I created a baseline mortality. And this is a forecast mortality where I looked at the mortality from 2015 to 2019 and then projected it to what we would expect if that trending had continued up into 2025. So that's the orange line. And what we see is that the actual mortality is far higher than we would have expected from the projected mortality. And using this, I estimate in Australia up to the middle of last year, around 74,000 excess deaths more than we would have expected.
Well, that's very clear. You can see that the actual mortality is following the predicted mortality. And then the shots come in and the two graphs separate, and you have a whole new graph, which is more death than expected based on, as you pointed out earlier, a long history of a fairly stable patterns of seasonal death and birth.
Correct. Okay, so, and this is deaths by gender. So we know that male deaths are typically higher than female deaths at the moment. This is due to increasing longevity in the population. So our population has gone from, an average lifespan of 60 to 70 years to an average lifespan of more than 80 years. And males tend to die slightly earlier than females. So you see a normal pattern in 2018 up to 2020. And then the red line is when the vaccines roll out, and we see a spike in deaths in both males and females. But what I have been seeing is the female mortality is rising more quickly than the male mortality.
Wow. So clearly more people are dying, both male and female.
Male and female.
And the acceleration of female death is higher, which fits some of the studies we've had on adverse events and autopsies.
Yes, and also the impact on accelerated aging of these vaccines. So if you have accelerated aging, well, then people will die earlier than they would have. So we see rising mortality. Okay, so these are deaths by age of population. The line at the bottom is a male. This is for men. Males aged 0 to 44. Then we have our middle-aged, 45 to 64. Early seniors is 65 to 74, 75 to 84, and then 85 plus. And there's only slight rises in mortality overall in the younger males, but we see a very pronounced spike in mortality in the older adults and particularly in the seniors, meaning that these products are killing off seniors far earlier than they would have died.
And, this fits with some of the calculations of Dr. Rancourt. And in a conversation he said that the thing that struck him the most wasn't the 17.5 million people dead from the result of the injections by the beginning of 2023. It was just how much more deadly the injections were to the elderly population, which makes the prioritizing the elderly, the vulnerable, makes it a bit perverse when you see the reality is the shots were more effective at killing old people than young people.
Yeah, absolutely. We locked down to protect the elderly and then we killed them with the vaccine. It's also because older people have less health resilience. So, when you're young and healthy, if something happens, you have reserve capacity to recover. Whereas older people may be functioning well, but their reserve capacity is quite limited and they can be pushed over the edge much more readily than younger people.
And Sally, would you agree as well? When we look at the younger age group there, and some people could look at this graph and say, oh, it doesn't look like you have too much to worry about if you're young. But still being alive is not the same as being on a negative health trajectory to die early. This is still early in the game. And we all know a lot of people who are injured, a lot of people who are sick, a lot of people with vaccine-induced AIDS, et cetera, immune deficiencies, cancers, et cetera. So I just caution people against looking at this and saying, oh, good, as long as you're under 44, you're good. Go ahead and take the shots. It's not that good, but boy, it's effective at killing the old in the short term.
But this is population-wide data. The uptake of booster shots in Australia is low.
Thank God.
There's not that many people. So when you consider that the majority of people don't want to take additional shots, but the deaths are still rising, meaning there is cumulative and progressive damage. And one of the key things to note is the trending for young people is going up.
Yeah.
And we see that the spikes in deaths are getting higher over time. So there's nothing to be complacent about. Don't wait until you're 45 and above before you start doing something. You need to be looking after your health, starting from childhood.
Yeah.
The MAHA movement, make America healthy again. If you start looking at your pharmaceuticals, your diet, your lifestyle, your sleeping, all of these things become critical in giving your body the resilience it needs to survive the assaults that are thrown at it. But if you add a vaccine, additional vaccines to that, you're adding fuel to the fire, and you're asking for problems. This is not in any way an indication that you should take more COVID vaccines.
No.
That would be insane.
We
Sorry,
are not
that's my
recommending COVID
personal
shots here,
opinion.
folks. That's for sure.
No way. Okay, this is the female mortality. It's the same patterns. Younger people, the 0 to 44, we only see slight changes in deaths, but we see rising trending then for the 45 and above, with the biggest spikes in the 75 to 84 and 85 plus. So
and these are dramatic numbers. I mean, even if you just look at the shift in the two curves, you're looking at elderly women going from 3,000 deaths, for instance, in a year to more than 3,500. And you're seeing the younger, like these are hundreds, thousands of people
these are
dying.
monthly deaths. These are monthly deaths. I just numbered the peaks.
Wow.
It's not the annual, but what we're seeing is that the deaths are peaking higher. In the latest data, we see some stabilization of the seniors, of the 85 plus deaths, I presume because the most vulnerable have died already. But we see rising deaths among the younger elderly, like the 75 to 84. But in both Canada and Australia, the deaths among elderly people is complicated by the MAID program, whereas they're pushing people to die earlier. And in Australia, they also have an equivalent program. It's medically assisted dying in Australia.
Yeah, Canada is the world leader on killing off the population through medical murder, as we personally consider it.
Yes, Australia's doing its best to catch up.
Wow.
Unfortunately. Okay, so this is Australia births, deaths, and natural population change from 2000 to 2024. So Australia's natural population rose to its peak, 162,000 population growth. This is related to births and deaths, not migration. Their peak year was 2012, meaning peak births and deaths were stable. And then we see in 2021, the jabs were rolled out. We see births declining sharply from 2022, although some recovery in 24. But Australia has mass migration, which is another topic. But we see our natural population growth has dropped despite migration.
So here we're seeing, since the 2020 introduction of the injections, more people are dying, less people are being born, and the population is collapsing.
Yeah, the population growth is declining. The natural population growth. Migration complicates that.
Yeah.
Okay, so these are just births, deaths, and net migration. So the top line is Australia's population has grown from 19.1 million in 2000 up to 27.4 million in 2024, thanks to migration. This is net migration, so we see a big drop in migration in 2020, 21, made up in 22, 23. And we see the spike in deaths in 2022, particularly, so births, spike in births in 2021. This is, people had their babies while they're in lockdown, got pregnant, followed by a drop in births. And the births are going down slowly, and the deaths rising, particularly the death spike in 2022. So Australia's population somewhat compensated by migration, but very complex political and social situation around that.
It's interesting to see the interplay of sort of two globalist operations, one being the COVID forced genetic injection campaign, and the other being the great replacement with radical migration. And here it is, very, very plain to see right in front of our eyes.
Yes, Australia is not recognizable anymore to the Australia I grew up in. And it's not that Australia is against migration, because Australia is a country of migrants. My mother as a migrant to Australia, but the migration of people from cultures that are not compatible with Western values and the lenient political and law enforcement environment that allows those migrants to express themselves in ways that is alien to the culture of their new home.